Hi, and welcome to Running on Carbs podcast. This is your host and your coach, Coach Val, and I would like to welcome you to episode number 30 of the Running on Carbs podcast. I am so excited to be here with you today to share something that I have had on my mind as I am going through my peak week of training right now for my redemption half marathon, as I am calling it. And, my weekly runs are getting longer. I'm still strength training. But this topic has been on my mind quite a bit because as things get hard, the brain and the body, they try to disconnect from each other. So once I get into the topic, it'll make a little more sense. But just a little quick recap, I guess, of what I'm doing with my training. So, if you've been around here very long, then you know that last year I experienced a femoral neck stress fracture in my hip, and that was in July of 2023. And I have been recovering after a stint on crutches and all that fun stuff. And I have been back to running since about late April, May ish of this year of 2024. And in that time, I've been able to build back up my endurance, build back up my strength. I've been through physical therapy. I've been doing strength training. I started with a walk run routine, went through that, built up strength. All of my runs are still purely conversational pace, so otherwise known as like zone two. If you're familiar with the zone training, RPE, rate of perceived exertion, right about the four scale on all of my runs. And that is done very purposefully because I am working on heart rate training and just keeping my paces easy. I don't want to overload the muscles and tendons and joints or the bone. So I'm keeping it very easy as I return to run and build my confidence back up, really, after such a serious injury. So um, I've overcome the new runner aches and pains, thankfully. As many of you may experience yourself or maybe have experienced in the past, I really suffered with calf tightness and calf and shin pain. Wasn't quite to the degree of shin splints. It never stopped me. It would go away, a bit after running, but I had a lot of swelling and tightness in my lower leg. And that is not too uncommon when it comes to building up mileage. But you have to be very, very careful if you do experience that because they can quickly and easily turn into something more serious. So I was very, very careful. I never had to, like I said, stop running, but I did take down my mileage at times. I would take walk breaks, so all sorts of things, lots of different TLC. At some point, maybe I'll do an episode on lower leg care for the new runner because there was a lot to it. It was like a second job, or a third in my case. So trying to take care of all that aches and pains so I get through it and to the other side and build up that strength so I could really start to run and increase distance. I do still continue to strengthen my calves, though. It's no longer necessary for me to foam roll them, though, which I was doing a lot of foam rolling with a medium density foam roller on the muscle right on either side of the shin bone. Um, and the calf itself in the back. But I do still continue to strengthen because you always need to keep your calf muscles strong and your soleus muscles strong because those are your power muscles as well and your stabilizers. So very important muscles for runners. And I continue to strength train that. But as far as recovery is concerned, much more minimal necessary now. So now I am in my peak week, and with peak week of training plans comes added stress, like stress on the body, fatigue, the whole bit. And what came along with my stress was my husband's cold. And I don't know if you can hear it in my voice today. I'm sort of on the tail end of it, but I still have all like the sinus congestion and waking up in the morning with that scratchy sore throat from all the drainage overnight. It's like, oh, yuck. Makes it really hard to get up and get going in the morning when that is how you wake up. So that is how I started my peak week of training for my half marathon. Um, but I am on the recovery side, so hopefully it's gone here pretty soon. Instead of running outside, though, in the morning in the cold and the wet, I'm very fortunate that I have a treadmill. So I've been doing all of my midweek runs on my treadmill inside where I could just open a window for fresh air, but I don't have to actually be out in that damp, cold air breathing it. And I think that's really helped. So I've been able to keep up on all of my runs. I haven't been so sick that I had any type of fever. There's no chest thing. So those are all really important indicators of whether or not you're well enough to continue training and running, or if it's, like if it's just a cold, or if it's something more serious where you really got to back off and take some time off from training. If it were to have settled in my chest like it did for my husband, I would have had a totally different story probably as far as being able to continue training. But thankfully, that is not what happened, and I was able to continue with my plan. So I am still on track. I am still going through my peak week. Tomorrow morning, I am running 6 miles, likely on that treadmill that is behind me if you are on YouTube watching this. Um, so last week's run, though, I did 8 miles. Last week was a cutback week. And in training plans, you always want to build in what's called down weeks or cutback weeks. And last week was my cutback and volume week. And I did 8 miles on the weekend. But again, I had that cold, and it was also I'm doing a dietary plan as well, where I cycle through higher carbs and lower carbs. Never no carbs. It's never like a keto thing. It's just cycling up and down through carbohydrates. And so the last couple of weeks before this week, I was on a down week for carbohydrates because I was in a cutback week. So I could take in fewer carbs. And now this week, in my peak week, I have upped my carbs again to give me more nutritional support. But it made last week's 8 mile long run really a slog. So those carbs are important. And I still fuel on my runs, even if I am in a cutback week. As far as carbohydrates are concerned, I will still take in my fueling for my runs. So that's in addition to, separate from any dietary changes that I might be making. But caused, like, the regular dietary lower carbohydrates did cause the heavy legs and a lot of mind chatter because I was fatigued and I was tired. And that experience is really what prompted me to do this episode today. So it got me thinking about the fatigue. It's a fatigue model that I learned about during my run coaching certifications, both of them. And it's called the central governor model of fatigue. And maybe you've heard of it. It's very scientific-y, which, as you know, around here on Running on Carbs, we are not scientific-y. We base things on science, but I am not a scientist. So we will be getting the version and explanation of the central governor model from a perspective of a runner, someone who can actually use this in your runs. So we're going to talk about, what is the central governor model? How does it impact your running activities? And so the best real world example that I could come up with for this fatigue model, where you might see it in action, and you may have experienced this yourself even, is you watch a runner in a race and they've slowed down considerably during the race, like nearly bonking. They're just really just like fatigued, and they've got all the mental chatter going on. Oh, I can't do it. I'm so tired. I can't make it. I can hardly make another step. They've really like hit a wall. And it could be resource depletion, it could be mental, it's probably all of the above. Fatigue, as in physical fatigue. But then something happens, and they see the finish line, or someone in the crowd says, "The finish line is around the corner." And all of a sudden, they get this like energy out of nowhere. And all of a sudden, this fatigue lifts. They're still tired. Don't get me wrong. They're still tired. They're still exhausted. But all of a sudden, their pace starts to quicken and they start to move and they start to run and they end up running to the finish line and crossing the finish line. So, where in the world did that energy come from? I mean, a moment ago, they were practically falling down on the course. And if the runner had truly bonked and they were truly out of energy reserves and glycogen reserves are gone, glucose is long gone, then they physically wouldn't be able to do that. However, they did. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Like how does a body do that? How does a person go from bonking and like on the ground practically to running across the finish line? So before we get into the actual topic, I do want to remind you that the October Apple Podcast review contest is still open. So I am looking to give someone an 8-week training plan customized to you. All you have to do is go to Apple Podcasts, rate the show 5 stars, and give it a review. Share some comments about what it is that you're finding useful from the podcast and what you like about it, so that when other people are looking for a show about plant-based nutrition for women over 40 who love to run and be active, that you can share your thoughts and then they can see if this is the show for them. And then they can become a part of our Running on Carbs tribe. So don't forget to post that on Instagram so that I know your review is there and I can enter you in the contest. Otherwise, I don't know it's there. Apple doesn't tell me when I get a new review. So, and I try not to like go and like look and all that. So just let me know it's there and you will be entered into the contest. Okay. So let's go on to our main topic. So the traditional model of fatigue is called the peripheral fatigue model, and it occurs when the muscle starts to burn, and we all know that feeling. And then the runner starts to slow down or stop because of the muscle reaction. So the muscles are burning, and you're like, muscle hurts. I have to stop. So that's the traditional model of fatigue. It's the body telling the brain, we're tired and we need to slow down or stop or change something. In the central governor model of fatigue, it's a theory that proposes that the brain is the one that regulates the physical activity. And that does that to prevent injury and physiological failure of the body. So the brain monitors various physiological parameters like the heart rate, like breathing rate, blood lactate levels, the burning sensation, to assess the body's ability to continue that activity and that exercise. So that's the central governor model. So think peripheral model is more about the body telling the brain. Central governor model is more about the brain telling the body. So the peripheral fatigue states that the muscle itself is the cause of fatigue, and the central governor model says that the brain is, not the muscle. And that's the reason for the decrease in performance. The central governor model also says that the brain controls the motor unit recruitment. So that's the number of muscle fibers that are being recruited to match the body's ATP production and consumption. I know this is where I'm getting a little sciencey on you. So here's a sidebar for you for if you don't know, ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. Let me try that again. Adenosine triphosphate. It is a molecule that lives in all living cells of our body, and it's the primary energy currency. So it's how the cell gets energy. It provides the energy that's needed for various cellular processes like muscle contraction and nerve impulses that are also important. And It's basically the fuel that the cell uses to operate. And every one of our cells needs ATP in the proper form and the proper numbers in order to create these functions and to be energetic and move our bodies. So this is also what we're working on as far as like building the mitochondria when we're running slowly and building up that endurance. So all of this is working together. I'm not going to go into ATP any deeper than that, but it's a vital molecule for what we do as runners. So, by matching the body's ATP production and consumption, then the central governor can prevent the body from breaking down homeostatically, which means homeostatically is that we're trying to keep a baseline. The body wants to stay in homeostasis. Um, and by preventing the body from, flipping out, basically, then that's going to lead to that energy depletion. So that's what it's trying to avoid is that energy depletion. And it's a protective mechanism um, designed to prevent catastrophic physiological failure of the body, such as like a heat stroke, for example, or muscle damage. So that is what the central governor is trying to do is to prevent these catastrophic events from happening to the body. So, homeostasis is the cell's home state. It's where the cell wants to be and should be when all of the systems that regulate the cell are working as they should. The central governor model also suggests that fatigue is a sensation or an emotion rather than an actual like physical event, which is the most controversial and interesting element, in my opinion, of the model because of a number of reasons, but I'll get into that in a second. So just keep that in mind that it's the sensation or an emotion, not a physical event. Very key. So, where in the world did this central governor model come from? I think it's always good to know sort of the history of where something came from and how it came to be. So, I'll give just a brief history lesson. The central governor model was proposed by a South African sports scientist named Tim Noakes in 1997, but he wasn't the first. There was actually a similar idea that was proposed by Archibald Hill in 1924. So this concept has been around for quite a long time, and Noakes really expanded on it a little bit more than Hill had originally. The model itself is not without criticism. If you were to go to the internet and look up central governor model, you're going to find a lot of differing opinions on this model of fatigue. So it is quite interesting, but there's a lot to be said for it, I think. And I've definitely seen it in action as many of us have. So, the model itself has been criticized for creating a false contradiction and for not providing enough information about the relationship between the central and the peripheral factors of fatigue. So, by saying that there's too many contradictions. Um, Noakes suggested that the fatigue during exercise is not caused by the depletion of energy stores like glucose or the accumulation of waste products like lactate, but rather by the brain's perception of the physiological strain of exercise. And that is where I have an example. And given that explanation, you probably have a lot of examples yourself. Um, so here's my example, one that I actually had fairly recently. Um, you go out for, let's say, a 6 mile run on your training plan, and all is good. You get through it. It's kind of like a non event run. Then on Wednesday, so that was on Monday. Then on Wednesday, your plan calls for 4 miles. So you did 6 on Monday. Now on Wednesday, you're going to do 4. While running the 4 miles, you keep looking at your watch and you're like counting down the miles and oh my god, it's only been a quarter mile. Oh my god, I've got another half a mile to go. And they just seem to be taking forever. Like your mile, it's only doing 4 miles and they're just taking forever to run these 4 miles. Your heart rate is kind of elevated, your legs feel heavy. You're like, "Oh, I wanna stop. I'm so tired." Um, but you keep going, and by the time you finish your 4 miles, you realize that you are so glad that they are over, and you're like, "I could not have done another mile. That was agony." Not that you were in pain necessarily, but you're just, like, wiped out. Mentally, you're just spent, so it's more of a mental thing, but there was a physiological aspect to the difficulty of your run. But yet you just did 6 2 days before, and you were fine, without all that mental anguish and without all that watching and mental anguish. So, what's going on there, right? You've had this experience where it's all very mental, there's a physical aspect to it, but your mind is telling you, "Oh, I gotta stop. Oh, this is not good. Oh, this is uncomfortable." Whereas only a couple days before you were able to do more miles with no problem. So another example is that let's say you're in a race and you've never run this race before, brand new to you. Got a lot of hills. It's an elevation course. Let's say it's a trail race, and you check the map beforehand. You know where all the hills are, and on the course you're nearing the last hill. You are mentally prepared for this hill and you give it your 100% because you know this is your last hill and you are going up it and you're going to run up strong. And mentally, you are prepared for that hill. Your heart rate, of course, is going to go up. You're running up a hill, but your breathing is going to go up because you're running up a hill. But when you get there, you celebrate in your mind. You're like, yes, I made it. I made it up this hill. But like all in the same instant, you realize it's a false peak and you're not at the top of the hill. And your heart rate and respiration, everything's still high and you misgauged. I mean, that's just the long and short of it. You misgauged. You thought you were done with the hill, but the hill is still going. This is where that central governor kind of kicks in and you might have heard that central governor talking to you on the hill in the first place, like, "Oh, this is hard. Oh, you might wanna slow down. Oh, you might wanna stop." But in your mind, you're like, "No, I've got this hill. I know it's ending right there. It's my last hill. I'm pushing through." So you're, like, shutting off your central governor. You're saying, "Mm-mm, I'm safe. It's okay. Stand down." Um, but now you're at this false summit and you still have to go up the rest of the hill. And so now your central governor is like screaming at you. No longer is it just talking to you. And no longer are you able to talk back to the central governor in quite the same confident manner as you were going up the first part of that hill in the first place. So there is a mental aspect to this in addition to the central governor talking to you, you are actually talking back in a way, all in your mind, to the central governor. You're relaying information back and forth through this process. Um, Now, dwindling energy supplies must play a part in this somehow, some way, because there is a physiological piece to this puzzle. And it's going to play a part in some of the feelings of fatigue for sure. And self-control, although it's not incorporated in the central governor model, self-control wanes over time, and it does have some peace in here, slightly. Um, but it's gonna wane over time because some of the resources have run out or they're threatening to run out. You're getting low on your glucose, so now you're having to tap into your glycogen stores, and process things differently in your body. So this is where the central governor model really gets kind of controversial because you can override, like we were just saying, you can override the central governor and fatigue with your own mind through motivation. So this is where all of your mindset work comes in. This is where your visualization efforts and work before the race come in. So motivation has a key part in the central governor model. And although this can be dangerous, as the central governor is really there to make you stop in order to avoid catastrophic bodily harm, this is a skill that the runner has to learn. And you have to know the difference between the overprotective parent in the central governor versus actual true danger. So you need to know, like in that 4-mile run example, there was no danger in the 4-mile run. You could run 6 miles, you just did it 2 days ago, you're just fatigued, you're just tired. Your central governor is like, "Oh, I'm out of homeostasis, I need to go back home. Stop." But you keep going on that shorter run because you know you're well fueled and, you're not going to die, it's just uncomfortable. So, this is where you can talk to your central governor. Um, but since the central governor states that the physical body is regulated by the brain, then the body can be overridden in times of physical exertion when the proper motivation is applied. So, for example, in that race, going up the hill, maybe you have a specific goal time in mind, something you have been training for months and months and months for. That might be sufficient motivation. Maybe someone told you you're going to fail, and that is giving you sufficient motivation. And it's just lit a fire under you, and that's what keeps you going. Maybe you're running the race in memory of someone that you lost, a loved one that passed away. That can be very, very strong motivation in times where the central governor is saying you are overexerting, but your mind, the other part of the mind, steps in and says, "Nope, I'm not going to die. I'm just uncomfortable." So the argument here, though, is that fatigue stemming from physical and mental exertion may not be separate systems, with the mental side overtaking the physical. Going back to the example in the beginning about the runner that sprints to the finish line. So, that first story that I shared, after hitting the wall earlier in the race, they sprint off to the finish line when they find out it's in sight. The central governor is proposed to be some central nervous system mechanism that takes information in about energetic needs, the current physiological state, and various motivational drives to regulate the physical exertion uh, to save the body from that catastrophic homeostatic failure during physical exertion, like running. Um, in one or if one or more of those inputs, those physiological inputs or the mental inputs, can be switched, then the body can continue to operate. So if the central governor, that's going back to the central governor, can be overridden um, if there are other elements that can be switched. So one flaw in the central governor model is that if it were wholly true, then no one would ever pass out from heat exhaustion or be hospitalized, or come into some other bodily harm, because the central governor model would do their job. The central governor would stop the person before reaching that tipping point. It's a major question to the model. Like, okay, if you're supposed to save the body, from a homeostatic complete failure and catastrophic, end, then how can it be overridden through motivation, through, as someone put it, through a smile, through some encouraging words, through a thought, or through a vision in your mind? So that is part of the central governor model that is questionable. So it's one of those things that I don't know. So before I go into that thought, without the central governor model, though, that's restraining the physical effort, people really might exert themselves to the point of hurting themselves and causing, serious bodily harm. And it does happen because, as we know, sadly, people do collapse from heat exhaustion. People do, and sadly, die at the end of races occasionally with unknown conditions. Maybe they felt them during the race, maybe they didn't. I don't know. Um, every circumstance, of course, is going to be different. But there are times when we overexert the body and it does fail. So, if the central governor model truly operated as its theory says it does, then how does that happen? But since it can be overridden, um, we have to be cautious and aware of that. So, no bodily harm, though, comes from mental exertion. Yet the same restraint mechanisms that's thought to be at work in the central governor model um, is at work on those, short, like little 4 miles that we were talking about. So it's quite interesting how the central governor model can work in both mundane situations and circumstances, like the little 4 miles, versus a, ultra marathon. And the ultra marathon, I think, is the most unique circumstance where the central governor model can be seen and overridden. Um, but I think in conclusion, like just really summing it all up, although the model is controversial or controversial in the scientific community, there's no doubt about that. It does offer a valuable perspective, I think, on the complex interplay between the brain and the body and exercise performance and running. It really lends an interesting element to running, and it also highlights the importance of considering the brain's role in regulating exertion and emphasizing that need to really listen to our bodies. And I think that's the key takeaway here from all of this that I've talked about today is we can override that protective mechanism. So we, with great power comes great responsibility. So we have to be able to know when to regulate and know when to realize that we are at a point of exertion, overexertion, and potential danger. And then that's when we have to pull it back and start really listening to that central governor. So, although yes, it can be overridden, there's a time and a place for mental fortitude. But then again, knowing that difference, checking in with the central governor, it's like, okay, hey, how you doing in there? Are we doing okay? Or am I just tired? Am I in danger? Or am I just really sick of going up this gosh dang hill? So anyway, it's a runner skill that you can develop, but it does take intuition and it takes listening to your body. And I also think you need to know that you're going into your run, you're going into your races properly fueled. Number one, that is key to making sure that the body can continue to function. So, if you are going to be doing a half marathon or a marathon, making sure that your glycogen stores are topped off and that you have plenty of, immediate glucose resources for your body to build off of and take from so that you aren't having to put additional strain on your body, that you are well hydrated, so key, and not overhydrated because that's another danger that can occur if you are overhydrating with water, creating an electrolyte imbalance in your body. That can have all sorts of physiological detriments to it. So, really making sure that you've properly fueled for the run or the exertion that you are doing or about to do. And if you know that you've gone into the race and the run with all of the right elements in place and that you are properly trained, then you can override that central governor when it starts to come on and you're simply tired or fatigued or you're just not having the race that you thought you would have. Sometimes that central governor kicks in around those times too, because you're otherwise uncomfortable and your motivation is low at that point. Um, and it's more of a mental game at that point. So knowing how to work with that mental state that you're in and pushing through when appropriate. And then that key point again is not pushing through when you've tipped over that tipping point and you are actually in the danger zone. um, that would be different. And those are, knowing about the differences between heat exhaustion, or just overheating, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, such the symptoms and things, for example, or the opposite end of the spectrum, and freezing temperatures. Are you safe in those temperatures? Temperature really seems to be a big indicator when it comes to the physiological effects on the body and running. So that's why I mention it, because it's also where the homeostasis wants to keep your body temperature regulated, and so your hypothalamus kicks in and it wants to regulate everything. So anyway, temperature is very key when it comes to knowing whether or not to override that central governor, or maybe listen. Maybe do start backing off on the pace, and and saving that race for another day, should it become necessary, or simply backing off for the time being, recouping, regrouping, and then kicking that in later in the race to come back strong at the finish. So there's all sorts of strategy, of course, that goes along with this. But I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about this interesting, controversial central governor model of fatigue. And I have a couple of resources that I'll put in the show notes, that if you're interested in reading some of these articles and studies that they've done on it, there'll be some links there. And of course, Google has a bazillion of them, but I can tell you they are technical, technical articles. So, if that's your jam, then go for it. But there's a lot of science out there when it comes to these fatigue models. I hope you had a good time learning about the central governor model. Maybe it was new to you today. Maybe it's something you've heard before, but it's a different perspective on it, and that it can be helpful on your next run. When that little voice starts to talk to you, talk back to it. I know it sounds weird. I'm telling you to talk to yourself. Yes, I am, but only in your head. All right, everybody, have a fantastic rest of your day. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Don't forget to go over to Apple Podcast and write that review. I really, truly appreciate it. And visit me over on Instagram, running.on.carbs, and drop me a note. I love it when people reach out there and share their thoughts about the podcast. I've had a couple of people reach out about, sadly, their femoral neck stress fractures. Oh, I feel so awful for them. But I'm always willing to, commiserate a little bit, but then give you some encouraging words too. So you can come back. And I will see you next time on Running on Carbs podcast. Hope you have a fantastic day. And don't forget, run your best life on carbs. I'll see you next time. I'm Coach Val.